This is the first Sunday of the month, and every month since September, we've been looking at a decade in the life of the United Church on our way to the 100th anniversary in June. February brings us into the 6th decade, and like every decade preceding it, it holds joys and hope and perils and danger. And like young Jeremiah, as a church, we were called to be part of all of it. Every month we've been exploring 4 things: church life in the context of Canada's life, Indigenous connections, one publication that the church wanted people to read, and a hymn written in the era. So as we're getting closer to the present, more people are remembering the history now, as it is part of their life and their history. In this era, Canada developed its own charter of rights and freedoms. Terry Fox began his Marathon of Hope campaign, bringing national attention to the need for cancer research and support. Though his illness forced him to leave his national run before he was finished, he became a symbol of tenacity, courage, and heart in the Canadian landscape. After 92 years of being a household institution, the Eaton's Company put out its final catalog. And Molly's Reach became a household word across the country as beachcombers of the West Coast made their way into our living rooms. Peter Zosky hosted This Country in the Morning and Morningside on CBC Radio, where he brought together speakers and listeners from every corner of the nation with stories of life in Canada. And the comedy troupe, the Royal Canadian Air Farce, transitioned from radio to television, bringing uniquely Canadian humor to share. In this decade, we made the move over from miles to kilometers, from Fahrenheit to Celsius. And they were federal programs put in place to introduce young Canadians to the country and to each other. Katimavik brought together youth in small groups from different regions to live and work together. Usually they shared 3-month projects, one in a French community, one in a rural community, and one in an urban community. And thousands of young people were part of the project. Rotary phones were being discontinued as the new touch-tone handsets made their way onto the scene. And the first personal computers arrived for home use. They were word processors and could calculate spreadsheets and graphs. They promised flawless professional reports if only you could figure out how to use them once you got them out of the box. And in this era, people were shopping differently. From the elegant downtown department stores that sprang up in the first part of the century, we moved to a new shopping phenomenon in the rapidly expanding suburbs, the shopping mall. Goodbye to the lunch counter and say hello to the food court. Many suburban malls started to develop in the 50s and 60s, but they expanded their horizons in this era. And the holy grail of malls, the largest mall in North America, potentially the world, was the West Edmonton Mall. Not just a shopping experience, it was everything you would ever need. Anchored by 3 major department stores, it boasted theme parks, water parks, theaters, restaurants, hotels, a skating rink where the Oilers practiced. If you went to the mall, you would see school choirs performing in the halls, fashion shows, gymnastic exhibitions, dog shows, and meet and greets with your favorite soap stars. The mall was the new marketplace, and there was something for every generation. But for all the excitement and innovation of the era, there were big problems that we had never heard of. Consequences of our activity on the earth. Evidence was mounting that chlorofluorocarbons that were used as refrigerants and aerosols were thinning the protective ozone layer and creating holes in the atmosphere. Sunscreens and sunblocks started to come onto the market, and people were asked to be sun conscious. Nuclear power, the hope for cleaner energy, was struggling with questions of whether it could be safely mined, used, monitored, and regulated. A reactor near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on 3 Mile Island, experienced a meltdown after only 6 months in operation. And there were system failures and costly upgrades across the board in nuclear facilities in Canada. In this era, the nation woke up to water pollution and lack of regulations. Hundreds of millions of tons of industrial tailings and untreated urban sewage were pouring into the Great Lakes, poisoning them for drinking and for use by citizens. Lake Erie, in particular, was dying. So the governments of Canada and the United States signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 1972, which established a commitment between the two countries to reduce immense nutrient loadings and clean up the Great Lakes. With beneficial laws put in place based off scientific analyses and recommendations, Lake Erie began to recover quite quickly. And by the mid-'80s, the revival of the lake was a globally known success story. Other jurisdictions across the country started to look at their use and abuse of local waters and waste. Interest rates more than doubled in this decade, causing massive numbers of loan defaults. Many farmers had been encouraged to expand and modernize, but when interest rates on their loans leapt from 9% to 19%, many lost their land and their livelihood. They sold up, auctioned off, and some walked away from their farms in the middle of the night, looking for salvation in the Alberta oil patch, which was booming. And then, as quickly as it rose, oil crashed, and we were in the middle of a second energy crisis in 5 years. There were gas shortages and encouragement to drive smaller, more energy-efficient cars. In the early 1980s, the nightmare of AIDS broke like a tsunami over gay communities in Canada's major cities. Young, healthy, gay men were suddenly and inexplicably dying. No one knew the cause of the epidemic. There was no treatment and no cure. With medical science struggling to find answers, the government largely silent, gay communities were mostly thrown back on their own resources. The first wave of AIDS activism established organizations that offered support and counseling and hospices to care for the dying. And once HIV had been identified, prevention campaigns were urging safer sex. And while that was wrapping up to be a global crisis, it seemed like the whole world was connected by many other stories. In the wake of the Vietnam War ending and the Cold War rising, global political struggles intensified. With the fall of Saigon and the Americans leaving quickly, thousands of Vietnamese people from the South could only choose between death and the water. Those who could crowded onto whatever vessel they could find and set out into the dangers of the ocean and the untested hospitality of welcoming nations. They became known as the boat people. 7,000 people were accepted into Canada. And it was in this era that the United Church of Canada signed its first refugee sponsorship agreement and began to invite congregations from the Atlantic to the Pacific to consider sponsoring a refugee family or group to resettle on safer ground. But violence in that region continued. The Khmer Rouge tore through Cambodia with such speed and destructiveness that people were only able to estimate the scope of the deaths, and the number of the dead varies between 1.5 and 3 million people in this decade. Violence and terror were everywhere. Disappearances and death squads from El Salvador to Argentina brought out waves of family members wanting to know where their loved ones had been taken. Their mothers, the mothers of the disappeared, or the comadres, kept vigil and kept the world attention on their plight and on the lives of their children and grandchildren. At this time, the Guatemalan military was carrying out a genocide against the Mayan people, burning villages and leaving more than 200,000 children without a parent. You can see the waves of oppression and violence by the faces of those who were awarded Nobel's Prize for Peace in this decade. Amnesty International, highlighting human rights violations. Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, leaders of Israel and Egypt, making an historic peace agreement in the Middle East. Mother Teresa of India and the Little Sisters of the Poor, tending to the most desperate people in the slums of Calcutta. Bishop Tutu of South Africa, peacefully opposing the violence of the hated apartheid regime. Lech Walesa of Poland, for nonviolent struggle for free trade unions and human rights organizing behind the Iron Curtain. And physicians for the prevention of nuclear war, who warned of the dangerous global health outcomes of the saber-rattling and nuclear proliferation of the Cold War. All of these issues were calls to action and topics of conversation, both in the national church and in local churches across the country. We were examining huge existential questions coming to us from every part of the globe. And in the midst of it, a powerful theology was developing, a way of understanding God, birthed in the struggles in Central and South America. It was associated with Gustavo Gutierrez of Peru and was called liberation theology. It mobilized marginalized and poor people to advocate for a more just and free life for themselves and their communities. Through prayer and Bible study, communities blended faith with action to change the systems that kept them down. They addressed land reform, women's rights, economic freedoms, environmental destruction, and democratic governance. God was the God of the poor, the God of the hungry, the sidelined, the dispossessed, the suffering, the missing. And it sparked the people in the United Church to go where the poor are, because that is where you will find God already working. Liberation theology borrowed heavily from Marx's writing on class struggle, and therefore, both the Catholic Church and the American government accused its leaders of being communists. Both sought to silence or sideline the movement, but it was very popular among the poor and among those who worked for change. Liberation theology pulled in support from Leonardo Boff in Brazil, John Sobrino in El Salvador, and Dom Helder Camara in Brazil, who famously wrote, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." And in this era in El Salvador, a very conservative bishop, Oscar Romero, was transformed in his leadership as he saw the suffering of the people in his nation, the poverty, the intimidation, the death squads. He became the voice of the people and a voice of opposition to those who were terrorizing ordinary citizens. He was assassinated while offering Mass. His very famous saying about peace is this: "Peace is not the product of terror or fear. Peace is not the silence of cemeteries. Peace is not the silent result of violent oppression. Peace is the generous, tranquil contribution of all to the good of all. Peace is dynamism. Peace is generosity. It is right and it is duty." Liberation theology stoked a fire in the United Church for its work on peace and justice, and about being guided by the voices of the poor and the marginalized. And so many of these global voices and these issues came to our doorstep in Vancouver in this decade when we hosted the World Council of Churches on the UBC campus for a week. We shared in the World Church's music, prayers, leadership, struggles, and hope from Christian churches across the globe. In this time and in this spirit, as a church, we started hearing the voices of Canadian First Nations people in new ways. Alberta Billy, an Indigenous elder from Quadra Island, helped to shape the course of history in the United Church. In 1981, she stood before the leaders of the United Church and asked the church to apologize to the Native peoples of Canada for what you did to them in residential school. Billy was a lifelong member of the United Church, and she was also part of the National Church's executive, representing Aboriginal church members across the country. 5 years after her public call for the church to apologize, in 1986, moderator Bob Smith extended an apology on behalf of the United Church to Indigenous people in Canada. These were the words of that apology. "Long before my people journeyed to this land, your people were here, and you received from your elders an understanding of creation and of the mystery that surrounds us all, that was deep and rich and to be treasured. We did not hear you when you shared your vision. In our zeal to tell you of the good news of Jesus Christ, we were closed to the value of your spirituality. We confused Western ways and culture with the depth and breadth and length and height of the gospel of Christ. We imposed our civilization as a condition of accepting that gospel. We tried to make you like us, and in doing so, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you were. As a result, you and we are poorer, and the image of the Creator in us is twisted, blurred, and we are not what we are meant to be by God. We ask you to forgive us and to walk together with us in the Spirit of Christ so that our peoples may be blessed and God's creation healed. That apology was received, and it was brought back to Indigenous communities for consideration. We'll hear their response in the next decade. And finally, something the United Church wanted people to read. A little booklet from 1982 called Guidelines for Inclusive Language. Reading it today, it sounds very rudimentary, so obvious, but in its time, the whole concept was greeted like it was some kind of revolt, a feminist plot, an unnecessary distraction. Why did everyone need to change their language to please a few oversensitive women? Didn't they know that all man meant everyone, and a clergyman could also theoretically be a woman? The booklet tells the story of a 7-year-old girl asking her clergy parents after a worship service, "How come it's never about us? It's always men and boys." Her parents, who had not supported inclusive language, saw through new eyes that their traditional explanation, "men means all people," didn't sound quite so good anymore. Men, brothers, mankind, sons of God, brotherhood, fellowship, clergyman, chairman, the minister and his wife, forefathers, the great men of our time. All of those groups required teaching girls and women that they were somehow included in that. The booklet even gave some suggestions for people to try out. They said chairman could be just chair or chairperson. Stewardess could be flight attendant. Lady doctor, lady minister, or lady architect could actually just be doctor or minister or architect. The fairer sex, the weaker sex, the girls could just be women. Lots of people were very accepting of the church and church business language changing, but the language of the Bible itself was more problematic. The Bible came from quite patriarchal cultures where men actually meant males, and the teachings were for them and about them. One of my favorite examples that makes that crystal clear is the story of Jesus' miraculous feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of Matthew, where the scripture says, after everyone has shared the food, about 5,000 men were fed, not counting the women and children. And that kind of summed up how those other people were viewed, not counting. So what do we do with words like, for God, like Lord, Master, Father, and King? The booklet laid out the problem and said, we don't want God to be impersonal. We don't want God to be an it. But it invited people to expand their imagery, to consider God as you rather than he. Try words like source, life, light, creator, sustainer, redeemer, spirit, divine, comforter, blessed one, holy one. It sought to open up new possibilities, to expand our images of God rather than to limit them. There was a lot of tripping over language as people sought to make those changes. I remember awkward phrases like, God thought to God's self, let us make humans in our image. But it is funny, after a few decades of practicing inclusive language, if you find yourself attending a church that hasn't made those language changes, it becomes very funny in the ear. There were lots of songs written in this decade. Songs of peace and hope, songs of struggle and challenge, And the one I wanted to sing today was written by Jim Manley and made familiar by the Strafties, who often came to Naramata Centers to do music in the summer. It talked about the holiness of the earth and how we're not treating the earth as the gift God intended. It was called Take Off Your Shoes. How many people know this song? Good. We're going to teach it. It's a nod to the story of Moses, who, when he saw the burning bush, was asked to take off his shoes because the ground where he was standing was holy, filled with God.